History of Mental Health by Juan Luis Cortez Cervantes. Lesson number 5, Freud and Psychoanalysis. As an introduction, the author would like to point out the same warning that he gave to the study and consideration of other intellectuals in the last lesson. This is a reconstruction of the value and work of Dr. Sigmund Freud. Pointing out a thinker is not the same as immersing yourself in his work. At the time this course was published, its author has a YouTube channel where he has dedicated himself to reading and explaining all of Sigmund Freud's work in Spanish. First in Amorortu editions and currently in translation by Luis Lopez Ballesteros y de Torres. So, the author of this course invites listeners to study Sigmund Freud's entire work for free and openly on YouTube. Even if you don't speak Spanish, we could get in touch and clarify any questions regarding the work of Sigmund Freud or psychoanalysis. We will now do a contextualization work with Sigmund Freud, as we did with the great intellectuals we have studied. We will begin by pointing out a changing Europe, as brimming with life as it is prone to conflict. It was the year 1856 when Sigmund Freud was born into a Jewish family. 364 years had passed since the discovery of America, and its political and economic effect had been accompanied by changes in the social order and an evolution of thought manifested as a challenge to Catholic ethical and moral authority. We move from the French Revolution to the Enlightenment, to the efforts to establish order in a Central Europe made up of many ethnic groups, among which were the Jews. A mixture of ethnic identities is crossed by the desire to form a nation and have a legal identity or laws that allow social order for economic growth. But saying it and doing it were very different things when the customs and traditions among the neighbors were so different. Here Catholicism provided a certain coherence in social identity, but did not necessarily unite subjects in Christian love. Heirs to the social order of the Holy Roman Empire, the House of Habsburg formed the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1867, when Sigmund Freud was around 6 years old. At the same time that political and legal unity was sought with the creation of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, within it the Jews were only one of many ethnic groups that lived under the influence of Catholic kings. The very word Austro-Hungarian indicates an empire divided into two capitals, Vienna in Austria and Budapest in Hungary, two parliaments but only one emperor, Francis Joseph I. That same emperor was the one who, on March 5, 1902, appointed a young doctor named Sigmund Freud as a professor at the University of Vienna. By that time the book, The Interpretation of Dreams, had already been published, but it had gone almost unnoticed in the national and international medical community. At that time, the word psychoanalysis was mentioned perhaps by one or two mouths, including that of its creator, for whom psychoanalysis was a tool at the service of medical interests, at least initially. Between the years 1900 and 1910, the life of this young doctor would take a turn from medicine to the formation of an independent scientific and cultural identity. We start from a doctor who does not seek mental health, but simply sought health with all the tools at his disposal, including cocaine as a kind of mood tonic. But let us remember that at that time, cocaine circulated worldwide without legal penalty, such that the original Coca-Cola formula included cocaine. Freud's passage through several of the techniques and methods that were used in his time to achieve health was not limited to the method developed by him, and that would little by little lead him to international recognition. Soon, in his professional career, the young neurologist would make an important observation about the typical mental illness of his time: neurosis. As a word within the medical community, we owe this term to the Dr. William Cullen, who introduced it in his work, Synopsis Nosologiae Methodicae, published in 1769. Note the Anglo-Saxon or English-speaking character and therefore of strong Protestant influence. While Cullen himself was not known to practice any form of religion, the same Anglo-Saxon language structure as part of Germanic languages such as English, German, Dutch, and Swedish forces them to speak of a subject within the structure of their sentences, while in Romance languages such as Spanish, Italian, French, Portuguese, and Romanian, the subject may not be present in the sentences, but rather be implicit. There will be later a place for linguistic analysis in the cultural phenomenon of mental health. Neuroses in Freud's time were clinical conditions typically associated with various characteristics of the patients. The first was that their diseases were not explained by anatomical or physiological mechanisms, as we considered in the first lesson. Those subjects, the neurotics, were not sick from the conventional point of view, since there was no biological or chemical element or injury that could explain the symptoms that ranged from headaches, paralysis, local anesthesia, diarrhea, cough, fever, to uncontrollable fears, physical inability to drink water or walk, etc. A physically healthy body, but with a series of manifestations that had no clear origin. Such limitations led many doctors to resort to the diagnosis of neurosis to simply stop seeing those individuals who challenged the idea of medical science that existed. A healthy anatomy and symptoms without apparent explanation. First condition for the diagnosis of neurosis. Another characteristic of neurotics patients was that they could not remember the history and development of their symptoms. Possibly the patients were lying when they said that they did not remember the history of their symptoms, but regarding the attention to the symptoms, since there were no causes, the treatments relieved rather than cured. A third condition associated with neurosis, particularly that form of neurosis known as hysteria, was that of being a woman. A word that united the entire medical tradition was hysteria. From Hippocrates to Freud, pointing to the occurrence of phenomena in the body that left doctors powerless at a time when a young Sigmund Freud was looking for an answer to care for his patients and make a living practicing medicine. I must emphasize, Freud practiced medicine, not psychology. Learning hypnosis in France from Jean-Martin Charcot and then practicing it in Vienna with Joseph Breuer, Freud noted the limits he had in the practice of this technique while he began to care for real neurotic patients from whom he was able to observe a particular value of the illness that continues to this day. Being sick gives the individual a diminished or altered value as a human being for the rest of the people in their environment. This altered state, although in general it is a transitory or temporary state, said temporality can vary from subject to subject and from disease to disease. Being sick with the flu is not the same as having cancer, and forgetting a name is not the same as forgetting to eat for several days. And this alteration in the value or functionality of the subject may be exactly what some patients are looking for. Not that they fake their illness, but for example, that they can catch a real illness to avoid going to work or to miss a certain appointment that they really don't want to go to. That is to say, although for medicine illness is what is valued as bad in itself, the Dr. Sigmund Freud, before formulating his main thesis, points out that illness can be a tool in human coexistence. In the words of the Dr. Sigmund Freud, before psychoanalysis, the patient has created for herself, through the symptom and external advantage, the illness has become a means of defense that she does not want to abandon. Case of Elizabeth Vaughan R. or Castle M. Studies on hysteria. The symptom provides the patient with a service for the most diverse purposes. It becomes important for their management of life, for their dealings with other members of the family, and thus acquires a secondary value. General observation in the text on the psychotherapy of hysteria. Motives of another nature are added to the formation of the symptom that are no longer of the same nature as the original ones, but rather seek to use the situation created by the disease for the purposes of the patient's interest. Studies on hysteria. Neurosis went from being the refuge of doctors and patients alike to a field of research in which Freud introduced a factor as controversial as it was unexpected: human sexuality. This is the element that separates the medical Sigmund Freud from the creator of psychoanalysis. The disease ceased to have a completely negative value, typical of medical ethics, to acquire a social value or even the power of the individual to stop the world that revolves around him. And if we now approach the reason why Freud introduced human sexuality, we discovered a particularly human overview. This relationship between the neurotic symptom and the patient's sexuality was indicated by Freud as a symbolic relationship or reality. That is to say, the neurotic symptom was in turn a power or right of the patient as a human being to become ill. And at the same time, the symptom as an organic, physical, corporal, and therefore social event provided the patient with an experience that could be linked to their own history, an echo of the past, a payment for the damage received in the past, a particular enjoyment in the face of frustration, a renewed power in the face of an unjust world, an erotic gratification and, properly speaking, a sexual enjoyment. From this dimension of the neurotic symptom, Freud introduced a much more complex dynamic into the doctor-patient relationship. Now, the patient was their own master and therefore completely responsible for their own illness. But how do you know if the patient was neurotic or really sick? Hence the importance of the work and figure of the Dr. Sigmund Freud, as well as the approach to each case from a medical and analytical point of view. That is, Sigmund Freud was not a mental health theorist. His method was not intended to interrupt all the symptoms of this or that mental illness of his time, but psychoanalysis placed itself in an exercise of power very different from that carried out in medical practice. In other words, health is not the doctor's task, but rather the result of a cooperative relationship between the doctor and the patient, both being defined by whoever creates, sustains, or destroys a disease, that is, the patient. In a sense, psychoanalysis is much harsher or more severe when it points out the patient's responsibility for their symptoms. And yet, it is much more realistic when it points out that a simple disease can become infinitely complicated. If the person providing it not only does not heed the doctor's recommendations, but also wants to get sick. But considering these propositions opens a whole new field of study and investigation of human reality and the formation of power relations in the social bond. To conclude this brief outline of psychoanalysis, let us point out that Freud himself could not say that medicine as a science had reached its maximum splendor, and he even hoped that psychiatry and chemistry would advance enough so that the world would not need psychoanalysis. But the evolution of the world and his discipline would have other plans for his work.